what led you to do River of Stars after you did Under Heaven? Did you not feel after Under Heaven that you wanted to move away from China for a little while, but you...
I actually thought I was going to shift ground, and a couple of things happened. I made a terrible mistake, and I didn't cut the umbilical cord with a number of alarmingly intelligent and even more alarmingly persuasive academics in Asian studies. That the people who I had been in touch with and dealing with as my resources. Because you get to a certain point in your work on a book, reading a book won't give you what you really need. What the book does for me is give me the starting point for 15 to 20 questions I've got for the person who wrote it, or if the person who wrote it doesn't know the answer, they referred me to someone else. And I ended up with a lot of good friends. And when I finished Under Heaven, a number of them were sort of saying, with the sort of mustache twirling, you think you're going to escape. And you have to do the Song Dynasty. And I would say, I haven't really done any reading or research. And they said, well, here's a list of books. and I got hooked. The second thing that happened, I could tell the story at great length or really fast, but it's a fun story, is that I was invited over to China. And I spoke in Shanghai. And then my publishers in China, who had brought out Tigana and Arbonne and Lines, your favorite, brought me up to Beijing to, this is what's funny about the story, and I swear to you this is the truth. They suggested that my wife and I were going to have an encounter with some Chinese academics and critics and writers at the Beijing Normal University. Now, I did pause a little bit over the word encounter because it carries a certain ambiguity that could be alarming. But I have this image of meeting some people for tea. And there would be a room of 15 people, and we would have a civilized discussion. And we got to the university that day, and we got out of the car, and we're being hustled down one corridor and out through the building and into another building and down the corridors and up the stairs, and they're moving us. And I remember thinking, is the tea coming on the boil? I'm still thinking civilized tea party. And we end up in the largest boardroom I have ever been in my life. And around the walls of the room are these ferociously intimidating portraits of what I guessed and was confirmed later were previous senior academics and administrative staff of the university. And around the table are about 70 or 80 academics. And around the outer wall of the room are about 140 students. You can tell they're the students because their chairs are uncomfortable. And I sit at the head of the table, and I'm still thinking tea. And the man on my left introduces himself as the head of the International Languages and Literature Department of the university, and he explains that he is going to direct the symposium. And I said, symposium? And the woman on my right is going to be my interpreter, and I said, thank God. And he handed me a sheet of paper, Nancy, and it said, I wish I'd kept it. It said, each paper, 20 to 30 minutes.
Oh, no.
Your response, 30 minutes, acceptable. And it occurred to me at the time, it wasn't one of those moments where you're really free to say, not acceptable. It didn't feel like an option. So what happened, and there's a point to the story, what happened was that 5 papers were delivered on the 3 books that had already been translated into Chinese and published. And the interpreter is keeping me posted on what they're saying, and it's wonderful. It's wonderful partly because, and you'll know what I mean when I say this, it was things I'd heard before from papers in English or French or Spanish. In other words, the universality of what was being picked up regarding those books. The last paper, which again I hadn't been prepared for, was on Under Heaven, which the academic had read in English. It wasn't translated at that point, and I'd written a paper in Chinese, and I'd written a paper about how the book so effectively employed some elements of Chinese literature to put a fantastical spin on elements of history, and how successful he thought the technique was. And I could still remember, I can almost give myself goosebumps. I could still remember feeling so reassured, validated, encouraged by the response there. It also helped that at the end all the students rushed up to get books autographed. I mean, that. But the intellectual sharing that was going on, particularly with response to Under Heaven there, I think became part of the backdrop for my thinking there's still room for me to do something else in China.
Am I wrong in thinking that this is, that River of Stars, the only one of your books in which the main character, Ren, is based on a real person?
I've done it before. In Lions, Rodrigo Belmonte is El Cid, and Ammar ibn Khayran is based on Ibn Ammar, who was a famous courtier. In Song for Arbonne, some of the troubadours are inspired by real. I have done it before. I have done it before. Certainly in this one, the two main protagonists, Ren Dayan and Lin Shan, I found my way into the Song dynasty of the 12th century when I realized that I could anchor a book around these two people who are evoking and inspired by, in the way that some of you will know how I work. They're inspired by real figures and real history. Shan in particular. I always want to find ways to let women play a significant role and have a strong part. And I always want to avoid cheating. I dislike the historical fiction books. We've talked about this, where a 21st century woman is wearing a Tudor costume. I don't like, I mean, we laugh about it, but that is in fact a tremendously successful way to deal with history. We superimpose our values. We end up with readers saying, I can relate to her. You shouldn't be able to relate in any easy, automatic way. And Shan was inspired by the most beloved poet. You probably got one in front of the poetry section. There's probably a couple of translations of her books here. And if there aren't, there should be. Her name is Li Qingzhou, and she lived in the Northern Song dynasty. And her work is, to this day, beloved and revered by men and women in China. And she lived a totally distinctive, unique life, because the Song was the period where women's scope, ambit, acceptance was being cut back from where it had been in previous dynasties for a variety of reasons. And Li Qingzhou, or Mai Lin Shan, is cutting directly against what the culture is doing. And I loved it because it let me do what I like to do, which is work with a strong female character, but not feel that I'm abusing the historical setting I'm working with, because there was a template. There was a person who operated that way.
After the first three books, what do you think inspired you to take these historical settings and add that dollop of fantasy? Did you grow up as a fantasy reader, or did you want to be a historian? You know, where did the combination?
I wanted to play shortstop for the Yankees.
Sort of like, Guy, not the Yankees.
Listen, he has a broken ankle. There's room.
The Detroit Tigers, maybe, but not that.
It was gradual, Nancy. It wasn't as if a light bulb went off and I said I will do something. I did read more history than fantasy, certainly, when young. I read everything. I read Archie comics, and I read The Great Gatsby back to back at 7 or 8 or 9. You know, you were doing the same thing.
Oh yes,
I'm sure.
I was.
Yeah. It's the omnivorous reader without discrimination, and I don't see any problem with that. Everything just floods in, and later on
Right.
you start
Yeah.
figuring it out. I think after Fianna Bar, my first trilogy, what I always call my statement in high fantasy, there was a certain amount of pressure to do it again in the way that we all know there's going to be pressure to do it again, because as consumers of art, we may not like to hear this, but as consumers of art, we're immensely reactionary. The thing we say to a writer, a musician, a filmmaker is, do to me again what you did to me before. That we have insecure, varied, unstable lives, and we like to find some stability in art a lot of the time. And I didn't want to do that. I'm not very smart. I didn't want to do that route. Fairly early, I was afraid of being typeset and labeled. And I joked and said, I don't believe in 4-volume trilogies, which is, I've been using that line for a long time.
And it gets a laugh every time, I bet.
And Tigana was, looking back, I don't think there's any question, Tigana was the riskiest book I ever wrote. When I got the idea for that, using magic and the erasing of the name as a metaphor for what tyranny does all through history, all over our world. I used magic to try to crystallize how that works. And it was my agent at the time, true story. I think I've told this once. My agent fell in love with it and said, this is going to blow the roof off everything. And at halfway, he sent it out to my loving editor in the UK, who loved my work and was a champion of my work. And she wouldn't buy it. He couldn't get an offer for Tigana halfway. And I was devastated because I was young and I'm writing what I know is a book that is not only different for me, but it was also different for fantasy. This is in the 1980s, and nothing quite like Tigana had been done in the genre in terms of its use of the supernatural. So I sort of sucked it up and sucked up some scotch and kept writing.
That was before you gave that up for
That's right.
Campari
For
and
Lent.
soda
For
for
Lent.
Lent.
And I finished it. And the reason it turned out that it hadn't been bought was that the editors at the publishing house, and another one too, were terrified of how ambitious it was, and they weren't convinced that it could be pulled off. They weren't convinced at the partial level that it could be tied together. When it was finished, and this is the feel-good story for this author, it went on auction first in the UK and did very, very well for me. That was my commercial breakthrough book. And then was sold here again at auction. And so Tigana was the one that broke me out like a rash into commercial levels, right? But it was not, the reason I'm mentioning that, it was not yet as grounded in actual historical events as I then moved later.
Right.
Tigana's kind of halfway between, if you think about it. It's ambience, it's mood. It's Italianate and Renaissance. Brandon I was thinking of as a Borgia or Medici prince. And I actually thought of Alberico as a Politburo leader. I really did. I thought of him as a gray Politburo functionary. But it's not yet where I later went. Song for Our Bone is the book where I first started to think I'm going to deal with the Albigensian Crusade, France moving down into the south of France, and I'm going to try to anchor a story more closely to the general events of the Crusade. And then Lyons carried that further with the reconquest of Spain, collapsed into 2 generations instead of 400 years. So there's no, and it was evolving. I didn't say, okay, this is what I will now do. Nor was the magic bit by bit reduced, because Last Light of the Sun has more magic than the Sailing to Surround Him and Lord of Emperors. I've never been so structured. Each book is case by case, what it needs and what it suggests from the culture. But you're right, in the overarching movement has been away from myth and legend and towards history. That is an evolution of my interests.
Again, besides the Fiona of our trilogy, not quartet. Have you been influenced by writers, either speculative fiction or historians, or because I know from our correspondence how much you read, and we very rarely talk about fantasy and science fiction. We talk about other things. So, who are there authors?
Let me give you a wider take on this. I always back away from the what writers influence you most, because I worry that the culture has tended to think of influence in terms of what have you read. I'm influenced by being born in the baby boomer generation. I'm influenced by being male. I'm influenced by being Canadian. I'm influenced by being Jewish. I'm influenced by being, God help me, a Yankee fan. There's so much. I'm influenced by my father. I'm influenced by my father's death. There's so much that influences how we think and how we write and what we want to write, that to narrow it and say, as I can say, Shakespeare is unquestionably the greatest literary influence for me in large and small ways. But if I just answer the books thing, I worry that I'm valorizing or overemphasizing one strand of what goes into who we are as a writer. So I always back away a little bit from the books. I can rattle off books I've loved and books I love now, but it's not the same thing as answering what influenced what I did.
Right. I'm trying to think of other writers who do what you do, and I'm not a I'm a generalist. I'm not a
So am I.
specific. So so there's nobody. I look in vain, I have to say, for somebody who does what you do.
It's, what, Nancy, there's a very bad joke that doctors sometimes make about their patients, where they'll say, you have the rare misfortune of having a rare disease. And what they mean is there's not that much research money going into whatever your rare disease might be. You're better off.
Right.
If you're going to get sick, you're better off getting sick with something that's trendy. And I have both the privilege and the misfortune, to some degree, of being accused of more or less having invented a form. And I say jokingly, it's a combination. I said before, I'm not that smart. It's not that smart to do this. It's smarter to either do straight historical fiction or classic fantasy in whatever vein works for you. It's not commercially smart to do a blending and an overlap of two things, because you will miss some readers on both sides. You will miss the historical fiction readers, we've talked about this, who want their historical fiction to tell them the origins of the 30 Years' War, or to give them a feeling that they now know. When you see a movie like Argo, you now know what happened in the escape from Iran. You don't, by the way. But the illusion is one of the things that a lot of historical fiction readers want. Fantasy readers want their fantasy without a chaser, as it were. For the most part, you want to be down the middle of the street. The street changes. The street changes. David Eddings and George Martin are not the same psychological space, but they're the same world space. And I'm not giving either segment exactly what they want, so I have to create a market. You're it. I have to create or find people who aren't locked into that rigidity of category. And so it's a mixed blessing, because you get, and I'm grateful for this, critical, scholarly, smart readers. I have really smart readers. It's that readers who are looking for something that doesn't fall into rigid categories. But you confuse people. It's that they're packaging in the UK for the release of River of Stars. HarperCollins, I don't think I told you this, I'm moving it out of their Voyager imprint, where they publish George and where they publish Tad Williams and where all their major fantasies are. They're moving it into their mainstream imprint. They're using an extraordinarily austere literary cover. And they're pitching it to the Hilary Mantel market. Now, that's wonderful if it works. But so everybody is trying to figure out. You've been trying for years, God bless you. You've been trying to find ways to say, don't be locked into your categories. There's something out there worth reading.
Right. You're talking about your group of readers, River of Stars was #1 in Canada last week.
That goes back to, it was #1 on the national bestseller list when it came out. That goes back to something else about the book world, which is in 1989, when all of this happened with Tigana, the auction and the big thing, the president of Penguin Canada and the vice president of sales both fell in love with the book. And they were not genre readers. They had read the genre, they were aware of it, and they made the shared decision that we're going to land this book on the bestseller list by making sure that people who will never pick up a fantasy will read this, and we'll make sure the fantasy readers find it. And they did it. I mean, I owe them a great deal. This is a long way back. And as you know, once you've been on the list, once you've reached that critical mass of readers, if you don't screw up, which you can always do, but if you don't screw up, readers grow. The readers who've decided that they like what you do will come back, and word of mouth is still the best way to sell books. So it grows. They established a benchmark and grew from that. It hit the bestseller list in 1990, and each book has done that. Here they're doing that, but they're starting from lower down the food chain, that each book is selling better. They were close to the New York Times, bottom end of the New York Times list with Under Heaven. So it's growing, but it's not growing from the same starting point.
Do you think it's going to make a difference? Penguin is your U.S. publisher.
Yeah.
Penguin's, I don't know, merger, acquisition by Random House.
The Random Penguin thing.
The Random Penguin thing, right. How do you think those Random Penguins are going to do? I mean, how do you think that'll affect you, or do you think it will affect you as a writer or not?
That's a great question. We go all night on that side of things. On the broadest level, it's bad news for writers. And so is the other merger that's happening, HarperCollins, Simon & Schuster. That's also bad news for writers because you lose a market, you lose competition, you lose an editor here and an editor there, both saying, I will slash my wrists if I don't get this book, and they'll be spending money. So you lose that. What's happening, I just mentioned with the UK moving the imprint and category. I'm published as a rock book in the United States as opposed to a Viking book in Canada.
And
that's
rock
the point
is
you're getting.
fantasy and science fiction. Right.
For the paperback of River of Stars, the book, I'm telling stories here. I'm telling tales out of school, but I think it's all right.
Don't tell anybody.
Yeah, right. Don't tweet. No, it's okay. The book hit the BookScan bestseller list in the States. Like the list goes down to 25 or 30 books. It's not the top 10. But it hit that list on the mainstream fiction side, not the genre. It hit the genre fiction side a different one, but it hit the mainstream fiction lower end of the list. And it looks as if the Penguin Putnam Group, even before the merger comes in, are thinking of moving the paperback over to one of the mainstream imprints. So the idea would be to market to the genre reader, to make sure the genre readers know it's there, but also make it more available to, if you will, the Hilary Mantel reader, who's not going to walk into the fantasy section of a bookstore, however good it is, and this one has to be outstanding. That's Dwayne's doing. But you guys know that if you're here. Yeah.
You know, because Sarah do not, her newest book is about the Borgias.
Right.
And there's certainly no hint of fantasy to be found in now I'm going to argue with myself about that. I have to think about that. But that's the kind of reader that I would say, oh, that's who Tigana would be good for, yeah. and making those kind of connections. This is, where do you want to go next?
With a book?
With the book.
I have no idea.
Okay, so do you give yourself some number of months to just sort of...
That's about it. That's about what it is. And then the little nagging voice becomes a large nagging voice. And I need some time for two reasons, or for several, but one of them is I need to let the voices of the last book recede.
Dissipate.
Especially if I'm shifting cultures. That it would just be wrong to have the tone in which I wrote Lines of Al-Wassam, the particularly intense tone that suited high drama in Spain. For that tone to be what I used for a Byzantine intrigue or for an Anglo-Saxons and Vikings novel would be wrong. And there's no question, if you spend as long as I do on a given book, which is about 3 years now, you end up with a diction, you end up with a way of phrasing and thinking. And I don't want to do that. So I need a certain amount of time to be removed from. It didn't happen here. It was okay.
Because you were
that
so
these
close
two books were running in the same general way. But if I don't do China next, then I need some time to figure out what the voice is.
Do you begin with characters?
Setting. I begin with setting. I begin with setting.
A period that particularly interests you, and then
theme and character.
And then theme
and character. I need the theme, Nancy, because if I'm going to spend 3 bloody years telling a story, I need to know why I'm telling it and why I want you to read 630 pages. That's a chunk of your life. And so I need a reason why I'm investing this time, and that emerges with, this is what I would like in an overarching way to be exploring here. Then the characters, and the last thing is the narrative, the plot.
The plot.
Yeah.
Was there some thought about doing this as 2 books, like
No.
the Sarantian books? It was
No,
always
never
going to be
thought
one?
that. The only time that's ever happened to me in progress was that I didn't think of the Sarantine Mosaic as 2 books when I began sailing to Sarantium. And then partway into that first book, I realized that that was a single man's journey. And the second half of the story, whether it was one book or not, if it was one book, was going to be so different in scale, because once Crispin gets to Sarantium, the cast grows exponentially. It becomes a political novel on a very large scale. And so the tone there would be so different that it wouldn't just be enough to have sort of the end of part 3 and then you begin part 4. I needed a more radical break. That's the only time a book has caught me in progress with the realization that I had 2 books to do.
Was there one of your books that was harder for you to write than another?
They're all ridiculously hard. Writing is not easy for me.
Are they hard in different ways?
Yeah.
Are they difficult in different ways?
Yeah, they're difficult in different ways. That's a good way to put it. They can be emotionally difficult. Dianora in Tigana still probably feels like the most tragic figure that I've ever created, for me personally. And writing in her voice came easily as a voice, but the story came very hard. I'm just giving you examples.
Yeah, no, good.
This is fun. The second chariot race in the Mosaic was blisteringly difficult because, and this is a writer's problem, I knew I had done a good one in the first book. I knew it worked. For those of you who read it, that's the one where Crispin figures out why the charioteer went wide, which, by the way, is real life. I heard that story from a Formula One fan who said that it was done by a Brazilian and Italian racer who was leading a Formula One race and went wide around a curve when he was leading and had no reason to go wide. And he avoided a two-car pileup just around the blind curve. I stole that outright from Formula One racing. So I knew that race worked. I also knew, just because you get to a point when you realize what readers are going to expect, and I've established chariot racing so much as part of what Surrounding was about, I couldn't wimp out and not do another race. But if I'm doing a second race in the second book, it has to be, realistically, it has to be better than what was already good. And I knew it was coming. I knew it lay in my future, like doing taxes in March or something like that. It was, I dreaded it. I dreaded writing that scene. And I can't tell you now, looking back, what the brainstorm, I think, was that I could do a mirror image of what had happened in the first one. And it was extraordinarily difficult to get the idea. Once I got it, I was able to write it. There are scenes in River of Stars that are painfully moving for me. And you don't want to sit at your keyboard crying or something like that. You mistype, you do typos and stuff like that. But I do believe that the writer's engagement with his or her characters is essential for the reader to engage. That this craft is what keeps you from dissolving. You have to control it in a craft fashion. But the emotional engagement has to be there, and there was in this book for sure.
Let me ask one more question, then we could turn it over to the audience. In that opening scene in Under Heaven, where he goes to bury the dead, no matter what side they fought on, that was an incredible, for me, an incredibly beautiful, moving, unforgettable part of that, of a beautiful, moving, unforgettable book. Where did that come from?
First of all, thank you.
You're welcome.
We're both well brought up. Two things. I read a poem by probably the greatest poet in Chinese history, a man named Du Fu, who lived in the Tang Dynasty. And he has a miraculously good poem wherein he, the poet, stops a group of conscripted peasant soldiers on their way to a distant battlefield. It's called The Ballad of the War Wagons, or the Army Carts, depending on the translation you've got. And he asks one of the peasants, where are you going? What are you doing? And the peasant tells him they're going off, and then they start talking. And there are lines in the poem that resonated all through both books, actually. The peasant soldier says, never have sons. The sons will only grow up to die on a distant battlefield. If you have a daughter, it's interesting thinking what we know about China today. If you have a daughter, there's at least a chance she will be born and grow up and die at home. But sons are going off to war. And at the end of that poem, the last 3 or 4 lines are, I'm going to paraphrase, but he says, do you not know of that lake called Blue Lake in the far northwest, where the bones of the dead soldiers lie, and the ghosts are twittering in daylight and at night, in pain or in anger, endlessly. And that's the end of that magnificent poem. And I did some reading in that lake in the far northwest with the scene of the classic kind of, we'll analogize to World War I, in the trench warfare on the west, where it was utterly meaningless in the end. There was no result to the warfare that lasted 100 years there, except the result was colossal numbers of dead people. So that was the first part. But the second part, it's the weird, strange, wonderful things that give you a book. In the first translation I read of that poem, at the back of the book, there were annotations and notes for the translation, the Penguin edition of Du Fu and Li Bai. And at the back, it's explained that one of the two translators, who was Chinese, one was Anglo and the other was Chinese, this particular translator's father had been sent by the government as an engineer to the northwest of China, not far from this lake, in the 1950s or so. And this man, in our time, was paying shepherds and goat herds to bring him the bones of soldiers that had died in battle in 600 and 700 AD. And he was burying them. While he was out there in that part of the world, he felt it was a mandate on him almost, because he knew, and the bones were still there, unburied. So the shepherds were bringing him the bones, and he was laying them to rest while he was working out there. And that footnote, coupled with the poem, gave me the notion of somebody going out to that remote battlefield to do that. That's where it came from.
It's amazing.
It's the accident, Nancy. What's amazing and wonderful about art is the randomness of what can come into you and trigger an idea.
Yeah, I feel like we could go on talking about, each one of the books, but let's let the audience ask questions. Who has a question? If not, I will be happy to go on.
Which of your books do you recommend for a new reader?
A new reader? It's a great question and an impossible one in a way, because I need to know more about you. And I'm not avoiding when I say this. If you love fantasy in a traditional sense, read Fiona. If traditional high fantasy is what you've been reading all your life. When you move towards the historicals, I usually ask someone, what period interests you? Are you interested in Vikings? Read Last Light. If Byzantium intrigues you, go with that. If China interests you, go with that. There's no sequence that you have to read them in. The favorites, I would tell you this with a certain amount of real pleasure, that if you put 10 or 12 people in a room together who've read all my books, you will probably find 7 or 8 books named. I love that. There are certain writers, we know that The Great Gatsby is the best thing Fitzgerald wrote.
Or The World According to Garp is the greatest thing that John Irving wrote.
That's right. We know their summit. Right. And I really like the fact that there's no absolute consensus over what the best book is.
And
so turns on you.
And they don't need to be read in any, except for the Fiona of our trilogy, they don't need to be read in any order.
Since you've spent so much time researching China, have you attempted to learn any Chinese to try to get closer to the meanings of some of the poetry and original sources?
And I feel too old and fatigued and worn down to tackle it. What I've done is, with the poetry in particular, is I triangulate. I must have about 60 or 70 different translations and books of Chinese poetry, many of them overlapping the same poems. I do this, by the way, not just with China. I have about a dozen Iliads and Odysseys, and I have about 7 or 8 Dantes. One of my heroes, in fact, I may buy it here. Clive James has just released a translation of Dante. And Clive James, for those of you who don't know him, is like way up there. He's got a book called Cultural Amnesia that I've been selling all around the world for the last 10 years. It's nonfiction. It's short essays about the 20th century major figures. And so I do this all the time. I deeply regret not having classical Greek, not having Chinese. I deeply regret not having this. And my best case solution is to circle the translations in as many ways as I can to try to get a sense.
The reason I asked is because when Ursula Le Guin was here talking about Lavinia, she said that it gave her the chance to dust off her school book Latin and go read Virgil in the original again.
I think that Eliot learned Italian to read Dante. T.S. Eliot said he learned Italian because he wanted to read Dante in Italian. Yeah. But she had school book Latin. My school book Latin consisted of cutting the Latin class.
Do you do research to write your magic work? Do you do
Do I do research on?
To write your magic work, to write the
magic?
the magical parts.
Yeah, sure, sure. Let me give you a perspective on what I'm doing with the magic and the supernatural, especially in the last few books. Because what comes up a lot, the people ask me, in effect, why Kitai, not China? Why Sarantium, not Byzantium? And it's a legitimate question. And there are many reasons. Nancy and I have talked about some of them, but one that relates to what you're asking is that I hate, as a reader, the sense of smugness and superiority that we in the 21st century have towards the beliefs of the past. And historical fiction so often wallows in that. It, in effect, says, isn't it adorable that in 6th century Byzantium they thought that if you fired a wax tablet with a curse or a love potion, a love script on it, and threw it in an open grave, which they did before the grave was closed up, then the curse or the love tablet would actually take place. Isn't that cute? Or the ancient Chinese thought that if you didn't properly observe the rites when you buried a family member, that family member's ghost would linger unhappy, angry, could haunt the village, the house, an actual family member. They could possess you in their sense of outrage at not being properly laid to rest. And so much of historical fiction treats the beliefs of the past as vastly inferior to what we today know in our collective wisdom. And for a long time, I've wanted to write books. People are nodding, you see where I'm going. I've wanted to write books that validate the beliefs of the people in the books. So I will make the world be the way they understood it to be, from my research, from my reading. If they believed in China that there were fox women out there, it's a succubus kind of legend. It's a classic femme fatale, the supernatural woman. It's the Tam Lin legend from Ireland. The fairy queen taking away the young man, and he returns, and everybody's dead. It's 150 years later. It's Rip Van Winkle. These, and with an erotic subtext. If they believed that, rather than just say this is one of the silly things they believed, it seems to me more effective in getting you immersed with the characters and in the world. If I let that quarter turn to the fantastic, allow me to make it real that way. So that's one of the reasons, and it is grounded in research. There's an exorcism scene in River of Stars that's absolutely grounded in research. There are 3 levels of, in our world, Taoist exorcists. The low-rent village fellow who would be the equivalent of a wise woman at the edge of the village, and the slightly more expensive traveling guy who's driving a Chevrolet going up and down the road and selling his potion, and then the really high-end Rolls-Royce guys who only work with the court. That's true. I didn't make that up. I love when research gives me the ability to be grounded in actual knowledge and then do something with it. The same way when I wrote The Mosaic. I loved when I found out that there was a fight that took place at a certain period over what technique to use to lay the setting bed for a mosaic on a dome. Now, most people would say, I'm asleep on the 4th sentence of that, researching that. I got excited. I know it's a bit odd, but I got excited because I'm thinking I can make an argument out of this. I can get 2 people on differing sides of this, and I can show my protagonist on the more modern side, and I've got character development, plus I'm not just announcing that he is a great mosaicist, I'm showing the nuts and bolts of the craft that let you decide he's a great mosaicist. Stuff like that is meat and drink for me.
Are people interested in screenplays? Your books are so amazing. What's going on?
Hollywood is really, really good at foreplay. It's, we haven't gone all the way yet. There have been, we talked a bit about this at dinner, there have been Lines of Albasan was optioned a long way back, and the option was renewed. And it was optioned by Warner Brothers for Ed Zwick to direct, and for Kathy Shulman, who produced Crash, and Lorenzo de Bonaventura, who's the 600-pound gorilla. They were the major team together. The script sucked. The script was terrifyingly bad, and as I told Nancy, the only good thing for me was that the producers agreed that it was terrifyingly bad. It would have been a nightmare for me if that script had been shot. The closest, right now, the closest to being picked up, I'm going home briefly on Monday. And my film agent, I love my film agent and I hate him. My film agent won't write anything down. You almost think he works for the CIA. He will not write anything down. He likes to talk. He really likes to talk. And so I've been on tour, and he says, we've got some numbers to talk about on Under Heaven. And I said, in the logical way, send them to me. You know, I'm in hotels, I've got evenings, I have a scotch in my elbow, I can look at what we're talking about. So no, we have to talk about it. I think what he means is he has to talk me into something. I think he feels, he's probably right, he's more persuasive verbally if he's working on it.
Right.
So there's that. Isabel has been in discussions because Isabel is the easiest of them all to film. If you think about it, it's contemporary, you don't have to do period costumes, you don't have to build sets, it's modern day France. And so it's smaller.
Right.
The thing that has obviously broadened the dialogue for everyone is it's one general thing, which is that long-form television at the high end is the best thing going. I mean, I love The Wire, I love Deadwood, I love Breaking Bad. On the high-end television is the most impressive work being done. And specifically HBO picking up George Martin's thing has made everyone think there might be gold in them there hills. So those two things, and also if you write big books, you get a little reassured that there's a fighting chance that they won't cannibalize and destroy the book in trying to get it into 2 hours. Because they will. Mm-hmm. And getting any big book into 2 hours, they will do what Hollywood, the phrase in Hollywood is cut to story. And for the way I write, somebody once said that he never met a secondary character he didn't like. And I accept that. I accept that. That when you cut to story, that is what's gone. So I want to say one more thing about let's just throw something out to you guys. You began generously by talking about thank you for the many hours. And I want to quote somebody. We didn't get a chance to talk about this at dinner. Somebody posted, I think it was on Twitter, it may have been a comment on the Bright Weavings journal, that she talked about the discord or the discrepancy she felt about the fact that Guy Gavriel took 3 years to write River of Stars, and I took 2 days to read it. And that is always with us. That if we walk into an art gallery, a contemporary art gallery, and we look at a painting, we go, wow, or meh. And we may do that in seconds. We may do that at a first glance. We hear a song on the radio and we change the station because it's not grabbing us. And these things can have taken a really long time. It could take a long time to do something bad. It can. It can. And I think I may want to write something about this as a reader, as a consumer, as an art gallery goer. Just the notion I'll suggest to you to think about of giving yourself a bit of time in shaping and forming the view of a work, what's going on in it. And also think about how fiction, this is a mantra for me, is a dialogue, not a monologue. Is that it's not me speaking, it's you bringing your taste, we've talked about this too, your taste, your lifelong preference and what kind of books you enjoy, your mood that year, that month, that day, whether the book you just finished is the best thing you've ever read or the worst piece of dreck, because the next book won't be affected by that. You've all had the experience, I know you have, of reading something and putting it down because it doesn't work for you, and picking it up 6 months or 3 years later and say, where was my head? Or loving something and picking it up to reread it and saying, where was my head? It's very much a dialogue of author and reader. And I've said at times that if the author is trying to bring his or her A game, it's really, really good when the reader is bringing his or her A game too.
You know, and Paul, and we have talked about this. Paul Auster says in one of his essays that he says that he consciously, and I think that you do this too, he consciously leaves room for the reader. And that in the end, he says, and I'm paraphrasing, in the end, he firmly believes that what we're reading is a joint effort between reader and writer. And the woman who said she read this in 2 days, and you know.
I've never made it more. You're absolutely right. I agree with Auster. I didn't know that quote, but this particular book is very consciously written to leave room for the reader to work that way.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.